Section 30, Vespasian, Part 1, of the Lives of the 12 Caesars, by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Icy Jumbo. The Lives of the 12 Caesars, by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, translated by Alexander Thompson and edited by T. Forrester. Vespasian, Part 1, paragraphs 1 to 7. The empire, which had long been thrown into a disturbed and unsettled state by the rebellion and violent death of its last 3 rulers, was at length restored to peace and security by the Flavian family, whose descent was indeed obscure, and which boasted no ancestral honours. But the public had no cause to regret its elevation, though it is acknowledged that Domitian met with the just reward of his avarice and cruelty. Titus Flavius Petro, a townsman of Reate, whether a centurion or an evocatus of Pompey's party in the civil war is uncertain, fled out of the battle of Pharsalia and went home, where, having at last obtained his pardon and discharge, he became a collector of the money raised by public sales in the way of auction. His son, surnamed Sabinus, was never engaged in the military service, though some say he was a centurion of the first order, and others that whilst he held that rank he was discharged on account of his bad state of health. This Sabinus, I say, was a publican, and received the tax of the 40th penny in Asia. And there were remaining, at the time of the advancement of the family, several statues which had been erected to him by the cities of that province, with this inscription, "To the honest tax farmer." He afterwards turned usurer amongst the Helvetii, and there died, leaving behind him his wife, Vespasia Polla, and 2 sons by her, the elder of whom, Sabinus, came to be prefect of the city, and the younger, Vespasian, to be emperor. Polla, descended of a good family, at Nursia, had for her father Vespasius Pollio, thrice appointed military tribune, and at last prefect of the camp, and her brother was a senator of praetorian dignity. There is to this day, about 6 miles from Nursia, on the road to Spoletum, a place on the summit of a hill called Vespasii, where are several monuments of the Vespasii, a sufficient proof of the splendour and antiquity of the family. I will not deny that some have pretended to say that Petro's father was a native of Gallia Transpadana, whose employment was to hire workpeople who used to emigrate every year from the country of the Umbria into that of the Sabines, to assist them in their husbandry, but who settled at last in the town of Reate, and there married. But of this I have not been able to discover the least proof upon the strictest inquiry. Vespasian was born in the country of the Sabines, beyond Reate, in a little country seat called Phalacrine, upon the 5th of the calends of December, 27th of November, in the evening, in the consulship of Quintus Sulpicius Camerinus and Caius Poppaeus Sabinus, 5 years before the death of Augustus, and was educated under the care of Tertulla, his grandmother by the father's side, upon an estate belonging to the family at Cosa. After his advancement to the empire, he used frequently to visit the place where he had spent his infancy, and the villa was continued in the same condition, that he might see everything about him just as he had been used to do. And he had so great a regard for the memory of his grandmother that, upon solemn occasions and festival days, he constantly drank out of a silver cup which she had been accustomed to use. After assuming the manly habit, he had a long time a distaste for the senatorian toga, though his brother had obtained it, nor could he be persuaded by any one but his mother to sue for that badge of honour. She at length drove him to it, more by taunts and reproaches than by her entreaties and authority, calling him now and then, by way of reproach, his brother's footman. He served as military tribune in Thrace. When made quaestor, the province of Crete and Cyrene fell to him by lot. He was candidate for the aedileship, and soon after for the praetorship, but met with a repulse in the former case, though at last, with much difficulty, he came in 6th on the poll books. But the office of praetor he carried upon his first canvass, standing amongst the highest at the poll. being incensed against the Senate, and desirous to gain, by all possible means, the good graces of Caius, he obtained leave to exhibit extraordinary games for the emperor's victory in Germany, and advised them to increase the punishment of the conspirators against his life by exposing their corpses unburied. He likewise gave him thanks in that august assembly for the honour of being admitted to his table. Meanwhile he married Flavia Domitilla, who had formerly been the mistress of Statilius Capella, a Roman knight of Sabrata in Africa, who, Domitilla, enjoyed Latin rights, and was soon after declared fully and freely a citizen of Rome on a trial before the Court of Recovery brought by her father Flavius Liberalis, a native of Ferentum, but no more than secretary to a quaestor. By her he had the following children: Titus, Domitian, and Domitilla. He outlived his wife and daughter, and lost them both before he became emperor. After the death of his wife, he renewed his union with his former concubine Caenis, the freedwoman of Antonia, and also her amanuensis, and treated her, even after he was emperor, almost as if she had been his lawful wife. In the reign of Claudius, by the interest of Narcissus, he was sent to Germany in command of a legion, whence being removed into Britain, he engaged the enemy in 30 several battles. He reduced under subjection to the Romans 2 very powerful tribes, and above 20 great towns, with the Isle of Wight, which lies close to the coast of Britain, partly under the command of Aulus Plautius, the consular lieutenant, and partly under Claudius himself. For this success he received the triumphal ornaments, and in a short time after 2 priesthoods, besides the consulship, which he held during the last 2 months of the year. The interval between that and his proconsulship he spent in leisure and retirement, for fear of Agrippina, who still held great sway over her son, and hated all the friends of Narcissus, who was then dead. Afterwards he got by lot the province of Africa, which he governed with great reputation, excepting that once, in an insurrection at Adrumetum, he was pelted with turnips. It is certain that he returned thence nothing richer, for his credit was so low that he was obliged to mortgage his whole property to his brother, and was reduced to the necessity of dealing in mules for the support of his rank, for which reason he was commonly called the muleteer. He is said likewise to have been convicted of extorting from a young man of fashion 200,000 sesterces for procuring him the broad stripe, contrary to the wishes of his father, and was severely reprimanded for it. While in attendance upon Nero in Achaia, he frequently withdrew from the theatre while Nero was singing, and went to sleep if he remained, which gave so much offence that he was not only excluded from his society, but debarred the liberty of saluting him in public. Upon this he retired to a small out-of-the-way town, where he lay skulking in constant fear of his life, until a province, with an army, was offered him. A firm persuasion had long prevailed through all the East that it was fated for the empire of the world, at that time, to devolve on some who should go forth from Judea. This prediction referred to a Roman emperor, as the event showed, but the Jews, applying it to themselves, broke out into rebellion, and having defeated and slain their governor, routed the lieutenant of Syria, a man of consular rank, who was advancing to his assistance, and took an eagle, the standard of one of his legions. As the suppression of this revolt appeared to require a stronger force and an active general who might safely be trusted in an affair of so much importance, Vespasian was chosen in preference to all others, both for his known activity and on account of the obscurity of his origin and name, being a person of whom there could not be the least jealousy. 2 legions, therefore, 8 squadrons of horse, and 10 cohorts, being added to the former troops in Judea, and taking with him his eldest son as lieutenant, as soon as he arrived in his province, he turned the eyes of the neighbouring provinces upon him, by reforming immediately the discipline of the camp, and engaging the enemy once or twice with such resolution, that, in the attack of a castle, he had his knee hurt by the stroke of a stone, and received several arrows in his shield. After the deaths of Nero and Galba, whilst Otho and Vitellius were contending for the sovereignty, he entertained hopes of obtaining the empire, with the prospect of which he had long before flattered himself, from the following omens. Upon an estate belonging to the Flavian family, in the neighbourhood of Rome, there was an old oak, sacred to Mars, which, at the several deliveries of Vespasia, put out each time a new branch, evident imitations of the future fortune of each child. The first was but a slender one, which quickly withered away, and accordingly the girl that was born did not live long. The second became vigorous, which portended great good fortune. But the third grew like a tree. His father, Sabinus, encouraged by these omens, which were confirmed by the augurs, told his mother that her grandson would be the Emperor of Rome, at which she laughed heartily, wondering, she said, that her son should be in his dotage, whilst she continued still in full possession of her faculties. Afterwards, in his aedileship, when Caius Caesar, being enraged at his not taking care to have the streets kept clean, ordered the soldiers to fill the bosom of his gown with dirt, some persons at that time construed it into a sign that the government, being trampled under foot and deserted in some civil commotion, would fall under his protection, and as it were into his lap. Once, while he was at dinner, a strange dog, that wandered about the streets, brought a man's hand, and laid it under the table. And another time, while he was at supper, a plough-ox, throwing the yoke off his neck, broke into the room, and after he had frightened away all the attendants, on a sudden, as if he was tired, fell down at his feet, as he lay still upon his couch, and hung down his neck. A cypress tree, likewise, in a field belonging to the family, was torn up by the roots, and laid flat upon the ground, when there was no violent wind. But next day it rose again fresher and stronger than before. He dreamt in Achaia that the good fortune of himself and his family would begin when Nero had a tooth drawn, and it happened that the day after, a surgeon coming into the hall showed him a tooth which he had just extracted from Nero. In Judea, upon his consulting the oracle of the divinity at Carmel, the answer was so encouraging as to assure him of success in anything he projected, however great or important it might be. And when Josephus, one of the noble prisoners, was put in chains, he confidently affirmed that he should be released in a very short time by the same Vespasian, but he would be emperor first. Some omens were likewise mentioned in the news from Rome, and among others that Nero, towards the close of his days, was commanded in a dream to carry Jupiter's sacred chariot out of the sanctuary where it stood to Vespasian's house, and conduct it thence into the circus. Also, not long afterwards, as Galba was going to the election, in which he was created consul for the second time, a statue of the divine Julius turned towards the east, and in the field of Bedriacum, before the battle began, 2 eagles engaged in the sight of the army, and one of them being beaten, a third came from the east, and drove away the conqueror. He made, however, no attempt upon the sovereignty, though his friends were very ready to support him, and even pressed him to the enterprise, until he was encouraged to it by the fortuitous aid of persons unknown to him and at a distance. 2,000 men, drawn out of the 3 legions in the Moesian army, had been sent to the assistance of Otho. While they were upon their march, news came that he had been defeated, and had put an end to his life, notwithstanding which they continued their march as far as Aquileia, pretending that they gave no credit to the report. There, tempted by the opportunity which the disorder of the times afforded them, they ravaged and plundered the country at discretion, until at length, fearing to be called to an account on their return, and punished for it, they resolved upon choosing and creating an emperor. For they were no ways inferior, they said, to the army which made Galba emperor, nor to the Praetorian troops which had set up Otho, nor the army in Germany to whom Vitellius owed his elevation. The names of all the consular lieutenants, therefore, being taken into consideration, and one objecting to one, and another to another for various reasons, at last some of the 3rd legion, which a little before Nero's death had been removed out of Syria into Moesia, extolled Vespasian in high terms, and all the rest assenting, his name was immediately inscribed on their standards. The design was nevertheless quashed for a time, the troops being brought to submit to Vitellius a little longer. However, the fact becoming known, Tiberius Alexander, governor of Egypt, first obliged the legions under his command to swear obedience to Vespasian as their emperor on the calends, the 1st of July, which was observed ever after as the day of his accession to the empire, and upon the 5th of the Ides of the same month, the army in Judea, where he then was, also swore allegiance to him. What contributed greatly to forward the affair was a copy of a letter, whether real or counterfeit, which was circulated, and said to have been written by Otho before his decease to Vespasian, recommending to him in the most urgent terms to avenge his death, and entreating him to come to the aid of the commonwealth, as well as a report which was circulated, that Vitellius, after his success against Otho, proposed to change the winter quarters of the legions, and remove those in Germany to a less hazardous station and a warmer climate. Moreover, amongst the governors of provinces, Licinius Mucianus, dropping the grudge arising from the jealousy of which he had hitherto made no secret, promised to join him with the Syrian army, and among the allied kings, Volugasus, king of the Parthians, offered him a reinforcement of 40,000 archers. Having therefore entered on a civil war, and sent forward his generals and forces into Italy, he himself in the meantime passed over to Alexandria to obtain possession of the key of Egypt. Here, having entered alone, without attendants, the temple of Serapis, to take the auspices respecting the establishment of his power, and having done his utmost to propitiate the deity, upon turning round, his freedman Basilides appeared before him, and seemed to offer him the sacred leaves, chaplets, and cakes, according to the usage of the place, although no one had admitted him, and he had long laboured under a muscular debility which would hardly have allowed him to walk into the temple, besides which it was certain that at the very time he was far away. Immediately after this arrived letters with intelligence that Vitellius's troops had been defeated at Cremona, and he himself slain at Rome. Vespasian, the new emperor, having been raised unexpectedly from a low estate, wanted something which might clothe him with divine majesty and authority. This likewise was now added. A poor man who was blind, and another who was lame, came both together before him, when he was seated on the tribunal, imploring him to heal them, and saying that they were admonished in a dream by the god Serapis to seek his aid, who assured them that he would restore sight to the one by anointing his eyes with his spittle, and give strength to the leg of the other, if he vouchsafed but to touch it with his heel. At first he could scarcely believe that the thing would anyhow succeed, and therefore hesitated to venture on making the experiment. At length, however, by the advice of his friends, he made the attempt publicly, in the presence of the assembled multitudes, and it was crowned with success in both cases. About the same time, at Tegea in Arcadia, by the direction of some soothsayers, several vessels of ancient workmanship were dug out of a consecrated place, on which there was an effigy resembling Vespasian. End of Vespasian, Part 1. Section 31. Vespasian, Part 2. Of The Lives of the 12 Caesars by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Icy Jumbo. The Lives of the 12 Caesars by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. Translated by Alexander Thompson and edited by T. Forrester. Vespasian, Part 2, paragraphs 8 to 25. Returning now to Rome, under these auspices, and with a great reputation, after enjoying a triumph for victories over the Jews, he added 8 consulships to his former 1. He likewise assumed the censorship, and made it his principal concern, during the whole of his government, first to restore order in the state, which had been almost ruined, and was in a tottering condition, and then to improve it. The soldiers, one part of them emboldened by victory, and the other smarting with the disgrace of their defeat, had abandoned themselves to every species of licentiousness and insolence. Nay, the provinces too, and free cities, and some kingdoms in alliance with Rome, were all in a disturbed state. He therefore disbanded many of Vitellius's soldiers, and punished others, and so far was he from granting any extraordinary favours to the sharers of his success, that it was late before he paid the gratuities due to them by law. That he might let slip no opportunity of reforming the discipline of the army, upon a young man's coming much perfumed to return him thanks for having appointed him to command a squadron of horse, he turned away his head in disgust, and giving him this sharp reprimand, "I had rather you smelt of garlic," revoked his commission. When the men belonging to the fleet, who travelled by turns from Ostia and Puteoli to Rome, petitioned for an addition to their pay, under the name of shoe money, thinking that it would answer little purpose to send them away without a reply, he ordered them for the future to run barefooted, and so they have done ever since. He deprived of their liberties Achaia, Lycia, Rhodes, Byzantium, and Samos, and reduced them into the form of provinces, Thrace also, and Cilicia, as well as Commagene, which at that time had been under the government of kings. He stationed some legions in Cappadocia on account of the frequent inroads of the barbarians, and instead of a Roman knight, appointed as governor of it a man of consular rank. The ruins of houses which had been burnt down long before, being a great decite to the city, he gave leave to any one who would to take possession of the void ground and build upon it, if the proprietors should hesitate to perform the work themselves. He resolved upon building the Capitol, and was the foremost to put his hand to clearing the ground of the rubbish, and removed some of it upon his own shoulder. And he undertook likewise to restore the 3,000 tables of brass which had been destroyed in the fire which consumed the Capitol, searching in all quarters for copies of those curious and ancient records, in which were contained the decrees of the Senate, almost from the building of the city, as well as the acts of the people, relative alliances, treaties, and privileges granted to any person. He likewise erected several new public buildings, namely the Temple of Peace near the Forum, that of Claudius on the Coelian Mount, which had been begun by Agrippina, but almost entirely demolished by Nero, and an amphitheatre in the middle of the city, upon finding that Augustus had projected such a work. He purified the senatorian and equestrian orders, which had been much reduced by the havoc made amongst them at several times, and was fallen into disrepute by neglect. He expelled the most unworthy. He chose in their room the most honourable persons in Italy and the provinces, and to let it be known that these two orders differed not so much in privileges as in dignity, he declared publicly, when some altercation passed between a senator and a Roman knight, that senators ought not to be treated with scurrilous language, unless they were the aggressors, and then it was fair and lawful to return it. The business of the courts had prodigiously accumulated, partly from old lawsuits which, on account of the interruption that had been given to the course of justice, still remained undecided, and partly from the accession of new suits arising out of the disorder of the times. He therefore chose commissioners by lot to provide for the restitution of what had been seized by violence during the war, and others with extraordinary jurisdiction to decide cases belonging to the centumviri, and reduce them to as small a number as possible, for the dispatch of which otherwise the lives of the litigants could scarcely allow sufficient time. Lust and luxury, from the licence which had long prevailed, had also grown to an enormous height. He therefore obtained a decree of the Senate that a woman who formed an union with the slave of another person should be considered a bondwoman herself, and that usurers should not be allowed to take proceedings at law for the recovery of money lent to young men whilst they lived in their father's family, not even after their fathers were dead. In other affairs, from the beginning to the end of his government, he conducted himself with great moderation and clemency. He was so far from dissembling the obscurity of his extraction that he frequently made mention of it himself. When some affected to trace his pedigree to the founders of Reate and a companion of Hercules, whose monument is still to be seen on the Salarian road, he laughed at them for it, and he was so little fond of external and adventitious ornaments that, on the day of his triumph, being quite tired of the length and tediousness of the procession, he could not forbear saying he was rightly served for having in his old age been so silly as to desire a triumph, as if it was either due to his ancestors or had ever been expected by himself. Nor would he for a long time accept of the tribunician authority or the title of father of his country, and in regard to the custom of searching those who came to salute him, he dropped it even in the time of the Civil War. He bore with great mildness the freedom used by his friends, the satirical allusions of advocates, and the petulance of philosophers. Licinius Mucianus, who had been guilty of notorious acts of lewdness, but, presuming upon his great services, treated him very rudely, he reproved only in private, and when complaining of his conduct to a common friend of theirs, he concluded with these words, "However, I am a man." Salvius Liberalis, in pleading the cause of a rich man under prosecution, presuming to say, "What is it to Caesar if Hipparchus possesses 100 millions of sesterces?" he commended him for it. Demetrius, the cynic philosopher, who had been sentenced to banishment, meeting him on the road, and refusing to rise up or salute him, nay, snarling at him in scurrilous language, he only called him a cur. He was little disposed to keep up the memory of affronts or quarrels, nor did he harbour any resentment on account of them. He made a very splendid marriage for the daughter of his enemy Vitellius, and gave her besides a suitable fortune and equipage. Being in a great consternation after he was forbidden the court in the time of Nero, and asking those about him what he should do, or whither he should go, one of those whose office it was to introduce people to the emperor, thrusting him out, bid him go to Morbonia. But when this same person came afterwards to beg his pardon, he only vented his resentment in nearly the same words. He was so far from being influenced by suspicion or fear to seek the destruction of anyone that, when his friends advised him to beware of Metius Pomposianus, because it was commonly believed, on his nativity being cast, that he was destined by fate to the empire, he made him consul, promising for him that he would not forget the benefit conferred. It will scarcely be found that so much as one innocent person suffered in his reign, unless in his absence, and without his knowledge, or at least contrary to his inclination, and when he was imposed upon. Although Helvidius Priscus was the only man who presumed to salute him on his return from Syria by his private name of Vespasian, and, when he came to be praetor, omitted any mark of honour to him, or even any mention of him in his edicts, yet he was not angry, until Helvidius proceeded to inveigh against him with the most scurrilous language. Though he did indeed banish him, and afterwards ordered him to be put to death, yet he would gladly have saved him notwithstanding, and accordingly dispatched messengers to fetch back the executioners, and he would have saved him had he not been deceived by a false account brought that he had already perished. He never rejoiced at the death of any man, nay, he would shed tears and sigh at the just punishment of the guilty. The only thing deservedly blamable in his character was his love of money. For, not satisfied with reviving the imposts which had been repealed in the time of Galba, he imposed new and onerous taxes, augmented the tribute of the provinces, and doubled that of some of them. He likewise openly engaged in a traffic which is discreditable even to a private individual, buying great quantities of goods for the purpose of retailing them again to advantage. Nay, he made no scruple of selling the great offices of the state to candidates, and pardons to persons under prosecution, whether they were innocent or guilty. It is believed that he advanced all the most rapacious among the procurators to higher offices, with the view of squeezing them after they had acquired great wealth. He was commonly said to have used them as sponges, because it was his practice, as we may say, to wet them when dry and squeeze them when wet. It is said that he was naturally extremely covetous, and was upbraided with it by an old herdsman of his, who, upon the emperor's refusing to enfranchise him gratis, which on his advancement he humbly petitioned for, cried out, that the fox changed his hair, but not his nature. On the other hand, some are of opinion that he was urged to his rapacious proceedings by necessity, and the extreme poverty of the treasury and exchequer, of which he took public notice in the beginning of his reign, declaring that no less than 400,000 millions of sesterces were wanting to carry on the government. This is the more likely to be true, because he applied to the best purposes what he procured by bad means. His liberality, however, to all ranks of people was excessive. He made up to several senators the estate required by law to qualify them for that dignity, relieving likewise such men of consular rank as were poor, with a yearly allowance of 500,000 sesterces, and rebuilt, in a better manner than before, several cities in different parts of the empire, which had been damaged by earthquakes or fires. He was a great encourager of learning and the liberal arts. He first granted to the Latin and Greek professors of rhetoric the yearly stipend of 100,000 sesterces each out of the exchequer. He also bought the freedom of superior poets and artists, and gave a noble gratuity to the restorer of the cone of Venus, and to another artist who repaired the Colossus. Someone offering to convey some immense columns into the Capitol at a small expense by a mechanical contrivance, he rewarded him very handsomely for his invention, but would not accept his service, saying, "Suffer me to find maintenance for the poor people." In the games celebrated when the stage scenery of the theatre of Marcellus was repaired, he restored the old musical entertainments. He gave Apollinaris, the tragedian, 400,000 sesterces, and to Terpinus and Diodorus, the harpers, 200,000. To some 100,000, and the least he gave to any of the performers was 40,000, besides many golden crowns. He entertained company constantly at his table, and often in great state, and very sumptuously, in order to promote trade. As in the Saturnalia he made presents to the men which they were to carry away with them, so did he to the women upon the calends of March, notwithstanding which he could not wipe off the disrepute of his former stinginess. The Alexandrians called him constantly Kybiosactes, a name which had been given to one of their kings who was sordidly avaricious. Nay, at his funeral, Favo, the principal mimic, personating him and imitating, as actors do, both his manner of speaking and his gestures, asked aloud of the procurators how much his funeral and the procession would cost, and being answered 10 millions of sesterces, he cried out, "Give him but 100,000 sesterces, and they might throw his body into the Tiber, if they would." He was broad-set, strong-limbed, and his features gave the idea of a man in the act of straining himself. In consequence, one of the city wits, upon the emperor's desiring him to say something droll respecting himself, facetiously answered, "I will, when you have done relieving your bowels." He enjoyed a good state of health, though he used no other means to preserve it than repeated friction, as much as he could bear, on his neck and other parts of his body, in the tennis court attached to the baths, besides fasting 1 day in every month. His method of life was commonly this. After he became emperor, he used to rise very early, often before daybreak. Having read over his letters, and the briefs of all the departments of the government offices, he admitted his friends, and while they were paying him their compliments, he would put on his own shoes and dress himself with his own hands. Then, after the dispatch of such business as was brought before him, he rode out, and afterwards retired to repose, lying on his couch with one of his mistresses, of whom he kept several after the death of Caenis. Coming out of his private apartments, he passed to the bath, and then entered the supper-room. They say he was never more good-humoured and indulgent than at that time, and therefore his attendants always seized that opportunity when they had any favour to ask. At supper, and indeed at other times, he was extremely free and jocose, for he had humour but of a low kind, and he would sometimes use indecent language, such as is addressed to young girls about to be married. Yet there are some things related of him not void of ingenious pleasantry, amongst which are the following. Being once reminded by Mestrius Florus that plaustra was a more proper expression than plostra, he the next day saluted him by the name of Flaurus. A certain lady pretending to be desperately enamoured of him, he was prevailed upon to admit her to his bed, and after he had gratified her desires, he gave her 400,000 sesterces. When his steward desired to know how he would have the sum entered in his accounts, he replied, "For Vespasian's being seduced." He used Greek verses very wittily, speaking of a tall man who had enormous parts, Maxi bibas, cradon dolikoscion enkos, still shaking as he strode his vast long spear, and of Cerylus, a freedman, who being very rich had begun to pass himself off as freeborn, to elude the exchequer at his decease, and assumed the name of Laches, he said, O Laches, Laches, epan apothanais authis ex archais esai Kyrilos. Ah, Laches, Laches, when thou art no more, thou'lt Cerylus be called, just as before. He chiefly affected wit upon his own shameful means of raising money, in order to wipe off the odium by some joke, and turn it into ridicule. One of his ministers, who was much in his favour, requesting of him a stewardship for some person, under pretence of being his brother, he deferred granting him his petition, and in the meantime sent for the candidate, and having squeezed out of him as much money as he had agreed to give his friend at court, he appointed him immediately to the office. The minister soon after renewing his application, "You must," said he, "find another brother, for the one you adopted is in truth mine." Suspecting once during a journey that his mule driver had alighted to shoe his mules only in order to have an opportunity for allowing a person they met, who was engaged in a lawsuit, to speak to him, he asked him how much he got for shoeing his mules, and insisted on having a share of the profit. When his son Titus blamed him for even laying a tax upon urine, he applied to his nose a piece of the money he received in the first instalment, and asked him if it stunk, and he replying no, and yet, said he, it is derived from urine. Some deputies having come to acquaint him that a large statue, which would cost a vast sum, was ordered to be erected for him at the public expense, he told them to pay it down immediately, holding out the hollow of his hand, and saying there was a base ready for the statue. Not even when he was under the immediate apprehension and peril of death could he forbear jesting. For when, among other prodigies, the mausoleum of the Cæsars suddenly flew open, and a blazing star appeared in the heavens, one of the prodigies, he said, concerned Julia Calvina, who was of the family of Augustus, and the other the king of the Parthians, who wore his hair long. And when his distemper first seized him, I suppose, said he, I shall soon be a god. In his 9th consulship, being seized, while in Campania, with a slight indisposition, and immediately returning to the city, he soon afterwards went thence to Cutilii, and his estates in the country about Reate, where he used constantly to spend the summer. Here, though his disorder much increased, and he injured his bowels by too free use of the cold waters, he nevertheless attended to the dispatch of business, and even gave audience to ambassadors in bed. At last, being taken ill of a diarrhea to such a degree that he was ready to faint, he cried out, "An emperor ought to die standing upright." In endeavouring to rise, he died in the hands of those who were helping him up, upon the 8th of the calends of July, 24th of June, being 69 years, 1 month, and 7 days old. All are agreed that he had such confidence in the calculations on his own nativity, and that of his sons, that after several conspiracies against him, he told the Senate that either his sons would succeed him or nobody. It is said likewise that he once saw in a dream a balance in the middle of the porch of the Palatine house exactly poised, in one scale of which stood Claudius and Nero, in the other himself and his sons. The event corresponded to the symbol, for the reigns of the two parties were precisely of the same duration. End of Vespasian.